The train I'm on hasn't stopped driving for 17 days. Part 2. Mia stared out through the train window, her eyes fixated on the crystallized remains of Philip. They'd known each other most of their lives, and now he had become nothing more than a memory, forever preserved within the green rocks. It had been a day since the train broke down, but despite the time that had passed, there wasn't any noticeable change in daylight. The sky hung above us, blue and bright, though no sun existed to let us know whether we were still on Earth. Instead, the light seemed evenly distributed across the sky with no visible source. I tried my best to comfort Mia, though nothing I could say would ease the loss and trauma we'd all just experienced. Our best bet would be to simply keep everyone alive through the next part of our horrific nightmare. Though the crystals had slowed down once we retreated, they kept reaching out for the train, and had already covered 2 of the cars in the back, slowly inching their way ahead during the day we'd been stuck. They seemed to react to touch, spreading faster with any interaction between us and the environment outside the train. While trapped in the morbidly beautiful landscape, John had taken it upon himself to find a way into the locomotive. The entrance had been sealed by a heavy metal wall, and it seemed that even from the outside, there wasn't any windows nor feasible way of entering. It was simply a block of iron that had effortlessly dragged us through 2 dimensions, broken down only to cause us pain. John, as fit as he was, had turned into a spitting image of death itself, both from exhaustion and the infection spreading through his wounded leg. Pearls of sweat formed on his forehead as he looked for different tools to smash his way through the wall. A noble, but futile effort. John, you need to get some rest, I demanded carefully as I noticed him on the brink of collapse. I didn't dare say too much against him, both from fear of pissing him off, and because he stood our best chance of escape. No, I am fine, he shouted back as he popped a couple of pills, a mixture between antibiotics and painkillers. He leaned against the wall, looking out through the window at the ever-growing crystals outside. There's no time to stop. If we don't do anything, we'll be dead in a matter of days. I know, John, but we can work without you for a couple of hours. You have to take care of yourself. Just leave me alone. I need to think. There has to be a way inside. I know it, he said as he shoved his way past me, off to search for more tools. The train had turned quiet, illuminated by bright light from the sunless sky above. The air felt heavy, and was filled with the stench of dead surveyors, but it was still preferable to the threat of sentinels, and in addition it was now an easy task to search for both supplies and any equipment we could use to aid us in our escape attempts. Another day passed in the fields of crystals, and Mia still hadn't spoken a word, apart from checking on John's bandaged wound and instructing him to keep taking the antibiotics. Of course, despite the inflamed and painful cut in his leg, he refused any rest. Frank and I eventually decided that we'd force him to take a break, even if it meant physically restraining him. After a short talk with Mia to make sure she agreed, we set out to force John into temporary retirement. He had turned oddly quiet, and we had to search every car to finally find him collapsed on the ground with the bandage ripped off, and black liquid oozing out from the wound. Before we could even call Mia in to help, the train jolted to movement, quickly coming to a stop as the back cars had fused together with the crystals. The train, it's working again, Frank yelled excitedly. Before realizing we weren't actually moving, we looked at each other in sudden realization and shouted simultaneously, the cars. We have to disconnect them, Frank suggested. You do that. I am going to stay with John. Tell Mia we need her quickly, I said as Frank started running to the back of the train. I sat down and shook John in an attempt at waking him, and while he didn't respond, at least he was breathing. I glanced at the black liquid trickling down his leg, forming a puddle on the floor, not daring to touch it. Whatever it was, it didn't look anything like the yellow pus I'd expected from an infection. Mia came running to my aid, quickly checking his pulse and breathing. He's burning up, Mia said. Suddenly the train broke loose, and we started moving away from the green fields of infectious crystals. Frank joined us with as many supplies as he could carry from the back cars, trying not to leave food or medication behind. I can't believe we're moving again, Frank said gleefully as he returned to us, showing little concern for John's deteriorating state. Near the front of the train there was a sleeping car, which we cleaned out and put John to rest. Moving the mountain of a mane was a tough challenge on its own, but it was nothing next to the challenge of keeping him alive through sepsis, as the infection spread into his bloodstream. Mia took on the task of watching John, making sure he drank and fed him his antibiotics while the train moved closer to Gehenna. It would only be a matter of hours until we reached our final destination, and I had yet to tell the others what the place truly was. While Frank was busy trying to contact the outside world, using one of the few battery packs still working, I approached Mia to tell her the pitiful truth about our journey. I sat down and glimpsed out the window. watching the landscape change as we quickly passed by. The infinite green fields that had taken Philip started to give way to solid rock, gray and continuous, with scanty cracks breaking its perfect surface. Tall structures extended from some of the cracks, looking like red tree stems covered in veins and arteries, pulsating and twitching in response to our passing. At the top they broke up into bubbles filled with swishing black goo, similar to what had oozed from John's wound. Red forests reeking of rotten flesh, growing in density as we kept moving closer to a literal hell. Every now and then, creatures would emerge from the densest parts of the structures. Bizarre beings vaguely resembling horses, with long bodies and impossibly thin legs stretching at least 15 feet away, and eyes that were pitch black. Sunken things, far too large for their heads. About a dozen of them had gotten an inkling to our presence, and galloped elegantly along our moving train, keeping up the pace. "Mia, I have to tell you something," I said carefully. She didn't respond. She just kept staring at the creatures that were following us. They never got too close, probably only curious as to what and who we were. "We're not going to make it, are we?" she said without a hint of emotion in her voice. "What do you mean?" "Gehenna. I know the name. It means hell," she continued. The red forest outside kept getting denser, forcing the creatures to break off, and as the trees grew taller, the sky darkened. "I am sorry. I should have told you earlier. I didn't want us to give up," she said. I kept my mouth shut. She'd been struggling with the same information as me, yet she kept helping us. It wouldn't make sense for me to confess that I already knew as well. "I am sorry about Philip," I said after a minute of silence. "Thanks. He would have wanted us to keep fighting." I checked the watch, only to notice the seconds tick slower than normal. According to the time, we were only an hour away from Gehenna, but with every watch having slowed down, there was no way of telling how far away we really were. "So, what do we do?" I asked. "When we get there?" I nodded. "I don't know, but right now we have to." She was cut off by John starting to shake violently, screaming in agony without fully regaining consciousness. At first, it looked like a seizure, but once we saw his leg we realized it wasn't anything that could possibly be explained by modern medicine. His leg had torn open completely, and black tendrils stretched out, wriggling around in the air as if searching for something. The obsidian black appendages looked exactly like the flesh of the Centaurs, and it immediately dawned on both of us that the Centaur had deliberately let John live after spreading itself within him. We both screamed in shock, unable to decide whether to leave John behind and flee, or to stay and try to save him. Frank came rushing in just in time to see one of the tendrils shoot out from the leg and try to grab me, but I ducked beneath it just in time. "What the? We have to cut off his leg," Mia yelled in panic. "Frank, get the knife and something hard." How are we going to do?" I tried to ask with a trembling voice. "We'll cut through the flesh with the knife, and try to break the bone." But, before we could even start to plan out the amputation, John shot to his legs, partially waking up from the pain, realizing what was going on. Get away from me," he groaned as one of the tendrils shot out at us, ripping flesh away as it extended from his wound. I pulled Mia with me out from the compartment, and we fled forward into the next car, just as Frank came running back with an axe he'd found. "Where's John?" he asked. We didn't need to answer the question, because John quickly followed us, walking with his mangled, sentinel-infested leg. One of the tendrils had grown out from the wound, forming an amorphous black blob on the floor, still attached to John, feeding off his body. His leg had completely shattered and split open, but the infection had spread even further, reaching his abdomen, covered in tiny holes occupied by more dark appendages. Amputation was no longer a viable option, so we kept backing away as John screamed in agony, visibly trying to fight against the sentinel's movement inside him. As we got to the space between cars, John unwillingly grabbed onto Mia with his arms. She fought back, but even without the tendrils, John was far stronger than all of us. "I can't. Stop it," he forced out. "Please, use the axe." Frank got ready to hit John, but one of the tendrils swung at it, snatching it away. John kept fighting, turning his head to one of the exits, reaching out for it with all of his remaining willpower. "Don't ducking die on me," he said before pulling the handle. The door opened, and John let himself fall off the train into the thick mess of red trees and darkness. I held on to Mia as she collapsed to the floor from exhaustion, carefully checking if she'd been wounded from John's grip. Frank closed the door John had fallen out through, and we all stared at each other in silence. John had died to protect us from himself, and with that, an immense feeling of loneliness overwhelmed me. Our best chance of survival was gone, and our next stop will be hell itself. I kept staring at the slowly ticking clock, based solely on my biological assessment of time. It felt like days had passed, but according to the clock itself, it had been no more than a measly half hour. It was the same with each clock on the train. They simply didn't work together with reality, measuring each minute as a small eternity. With John dead, we felt more vulnerable than ever, and since his death we hadn't spoken a word. I know we're all on edge, but I think it's time we discuss what we'll do once the train stops again, Frank said in his usual annoyed tone. Both Mia and I knew our true destination, but hadn't yet told Frank. Alas, time had come, and if we stood even the faintest chance of surviving, we had to be able to rely on each other. Frank, we need to tell you something, I said. His eyes narrowed in suspicion at my obviously guilty tone. Tell me what? Our destination? Gehenna. Well, I trailed off. Yes, what about it? Gehenna is hell. Frank, we're all going to hell. Mia burst out, annoyed by my hesitation. We fell silent for a few seconds while Frank processed what we'd just told him. Then, he suddenly burst out laughing. Really? Hell, that's the best you could do, he said. I just nodded in response. So, you mean to tell me that we're already dead, and that our next stop will be the realm of Satan himself? Yeah, I guess. Why is that funny? Well, if you hadn't noticed already, 2 of us died. How is that possible if we're already dead? Where's John and Philip? He had a point. Our conventional idea of hell required us to be dead already, though it never stated whether you could die twice, or what happens upon second death. We're clearly not dead, but that doesn't mean we're not going to a horrific place, regardless of what you might think. Gehenna means hell, Mia said. The argument went on fruitlessly for a while, Frank never giving in and admitting that we weren't going to reach salvation once the train stopped. In the meanwhile, I kept staring out the window. The once green fields of killer crystals has long since vanished, and the forest of red pillars had grown so dense that it finally blocked out each ray of light brave enough to attempt to illuminate our path. If I hadn't known better, I could have thought we were back in the void, but it felt different, far hotter than it had before, even more devoid of hope. Before I got a chance to question the environment, the darkness gave way to a large, open space, devoid of any life, just a rocky, flat surface surrounded by infinitely tall cliffs on each side. It was a valley, gray and dull, with little to no light penetrating a layer of thick clouds above. Then the train started to slow down. We're coming to a stop, Mia said as she peeked out through the window. The tracks end here. Before long the train stood still, and all the doors opened automatically, signaling for us to get off. There was a sign on the empty platform next to us, written in a language I couldn't comprehend. I pulled out my crumbled up ticket and compared the text, noticing that some of it matched. Gehenna, I mumbled. So what now? We get off the train and wander the wasteland, or sit here with the last of our supplies, waiting for hunger to kill us? Frank asked. We never got the chance to make a decision, before the train simply started disintegrating under our feet. First the windows turned to sand, then the seats rotted away as if hit with 1,000 years of time, and finally the floor started to crack, causing us to plummet into the ground. I groaned in pain as I landed, severely twisting my ankle, while the others landed slightly more elegantly. Mia and Frank helped me to my feet as we witnessed the last chunks of train just vanish before our eyes. We climbed off the tracks, and onto the platform. It was situated on a bridge, giving us a clear view of our surroundings. It was a city, or at least it used to be one. Now nothing more than the ruins of a previously inhabited place. Tall cliffs stood around the city, too steep to be climbed, too massive to allow for much light. We were in the shadows, clueless and lost. I looked around at the worn-down buildings, desperately searching for any kind of life, but there was none to be found. Without any other options, we headed down to the streets and started searching for a way out. The houses were mostly empty, too broken to set foot in without risking total collapse, filled only with crumbled papers written in a language none of us could understand. Where they had furniture, it was crudely constructed from debris of metal and what could only be bone fragments, but whoever built any of it were nowhere to be seen. How much food and water do we have left? Frank asked. Enough for maybe a day, Mia responded. He sighed in response, and we kept walking. I limped behind the other 2 on my twisted ankle, until we eventually reached a large, open square, surrounded with what looked like temples. Unlike the surrounding city, they were beautifully built in stark contrast to their surroundings. In the middle of the square sat an emaciated figure, a man with white, thin hair and protruding, prominent ribs from his starved body. He didn't seem to notice us as we quickly approached him to see if he needed help. But even as we spoke to him he just sat there, rocking back and forth as he mumbled over and over again in a hoarse, sickly voice. I just want to die. Why won't you let me die? I just want to die. Why not? Why? Mia bent down in front of him and tried to his attention. His eyes had turned white from cataract, rendering him completely blind, and chunks of flesh were missing from his chest and abdomen, visibly infected and smelling like rot. She reached out and checked his pulse, quickly retracting her hand. He's dead. What do you mean, dead? He's clearly living, talking and everything, Frank said. Look at him. No one could have survived these wounds, and doesn't have a ducking pulse, she said. Of course, she was right. The man should have been dead. Yet there he sat, crying in agony, begging for a death that never came, suffering, blind and deaf without anything to connect him to the world he lived in. What do we do? I asked. I think maybe we just finish him off, Frank said meekly. We can't. Mia stopped mid-sentence, realizing that for once, Frank was right. I am sorry. I think I've got to agree with Frank on this. He wants to die. The least we can do is to free him, I said, as kindly as I could. Frank pulled John's knife out from the backpack, and looked at us for the go-ahead. I nodded in return. You guys better look away, Frank said. He bent down behind the suffering man, and whispered that he was sorry, before quickly slitting his throat. To all of our surprises, not a drop of blood poured out from the newly formed wound. Instead, the man just fell to the ground and gargled incomprehensibly. A whole minute passed, and then another. Yet the man refused to die. The city wouldn't let him, and rather than freeing him, we'd just put him into a whole other level of misery, taking away his voice and ability to beg for death. I didn't, Frank stuttered as he realized what he'd done. With that, as if a veil had been lifted from our blind eyes, we finally saw the empty city for what it truly was. Rather than the desolate ruins we'd met as we entered, we saw a fully populated city, filled to the brim with suffering inhabitants, each mutilated in various degrees. Most of them were blind, with their eyes either ripped out or turned to coal. Those unfortunate enough to see had their limbs removed, or their organs torn out onto the street, unable to do anything to end their miserable existence. As the horrific realization hit us, the ground below us started to move. The city had finally noticed our unwelcome presence, and it reacted violently by pulling itself apart, creating a gaping chasm in the middle of the square that swallowed anyone unlucky enough to be in the way. What's happening? Frank asked in panic. I don't know, but let's get out of here, I yelled in response. The chasm quickly widened, revealing a massive hole extending down into a dark abyss, with spikes and black tendrils extending from the burning walls beneath us. With my sprained ankle, I couldn't keep up with the others, and slipped to the ground as it shook violently. Thomas, Mia yelled as she rushed to my aid, Frank continuing to flee towards the alleys. She pulled me up just in time to avoid being swallowed by the ground. We headed after Frank, who'd started running down one of the alleys, seemingly devoid of any people. As he entered the alley, the concrete walls started moving vigorously. Frank, wait, I yelled, but he didn't hear me. By the time he noticed the walls, it was already too late, and hundreds of spikes shot out from the walls, morphing out from the concrete buildings. Frank dodged the first one as he tried to retreat back towards us, and for a moment it seemed he was in the clear, before one final spike emerged and penetrated straight through Frank's abdomen. With a mortal wound, the wall fell silent. Frank collapsed to the ground holding onto his guts, unable to scream from the intense pain. Frank, we yelled simultaneously as we rushed to his mangled body. He lay there in shock, his eyes darting frantically back and forth between us, too wounded to move. He didn't even realize the severity of his injury. Mia tried her best to stop the bleeding by applying pressure, but it hardly slowed down the incessant flow of crimson blood. I am okay. I am okay. I'll be alright, Frank kept repeating in panic, getting quieter with each iteration. He quickly bled out, too fast to accept his ultimate demise, and all we could do was to sit over him as he let out a final breath, and finally fell silent. The ground started moving again, not to attach us, but to swallow Frank, to fuse his limp body with the concrete beneath him. Within seconds, he'd vanished, and become one with the city of Gehenna. Before we could get the chance to catch our breaths, the walls started moving once again. With my injured leg, I knew I stood no chance of escape, but Mia didn't have to die with me. Mia, get out of here, I yelled as spikes formed around us, reaching out to destroy our vulnerable bodies. Then, out of nowhere, a dark rumble sounded alongside a bright light, and the ground came to a standstill. An old man emerged from up the alley, wearing a worn-out, but perfectly tailored suit, and a cane in his left hand. The sound shook us, and I grabbed my ear futilely trying to block it out, but it barely helped. What the hell are you kids doing here? The man said as both Mia and I passed out. I slowly opened my eyes, momentarily forgetting that I had literally spent the past couple of weeks in hell. The old man that had saved us stood by the window, staring out at the empty street, mumbling in a language I couldn't understand. Good morning, he said without even turning. Somehow noticing my awakening, with a throat like sandpaper, I couldn't even respond. I looked around the room with my tired eyes, quickly realizing that Mia was missing. Mia, where is she? I forced out. Barely a whisper. Don't worry about her, Thomas. She's resting in the chamber as the infection fades, he said matter-of-factly. I pushed myself up into a sitting position, noticing a glass filled with a murky, brown liquid on the bedside table. Infection? I asked as I inspected the glass. It's the closest translation I could come up with. Everyone touched by the void slowly starts to drain, their souls wearing out as they merge with this place. He turned and limped towards me, revealing a mangled leg kept up by his cane made from bone and a bright green crystal exactly like the ones from the fields we passed. Everyone except for you, Thomas, he said. What does it even mean? I asked. Before the man could answer, a loud, brief scream could be heard from one of the other rooms, one sealed by a heavy metal door similar to the one on the locomotive. What was that? Without an answer, he limped over and touched the door with his cane. It morphed into an opening, which he walked through. Then it promptly closed itself off. A few minutes passed, and I got back on my feet, stumbling over to the door, unable to open it. I pushed my ear against it in an attempt at listening to the other side, but as soon as I touched it, the hole returned. And the old man walked through it, surely followed by a drowsy Mia. Tom, she exclaimed in joy as she embraced me in a tight hug. The three of us sat down around a table made from concrete and bone. You must have a lot of questions, and though we're short on time, I'll answer as much as I can, he said. Mia and I looked at each other, both wondering where to start. Who are you? I asked. That's a tough one, he said as he scratched his head. I am what you could call a guardian, and my job is to keep this place locked down, preventing any unfortunate souls from accidentally slipping through dimensions and ending up for the rest of eternity here. Before my time, I don't know who or what I was. I believe I used to be human, but it has been so long that any memory before this place has long since been wiped out. He paused, and looked at the untouched glass on the bedside table. Drink it, he said as looked me. Without questioning him, I drank the liquid out of some strange compulsion. It tasted like piss, but it immediately revitalized me, as if I had returned back home and recovered from the ordeals in hell. How did we hear then? Mia asked. The man looked at the floor with a shameful expression on his face. It's my fault. For millennia I've kept this place safe, but even I have aged, and eventually I will perish like all things should. And the people that are already here, like the one Mia trailed off. They came during the time between the last guardian and myself, when there was nothing here to keep the gates between our worlds closed. Those who meet an untimely death or narrowly avoid, unable to process or accept it, they all come here. I tried to help the ones that were already trapped, but they were far too gone. Not like you two. Not like us. No. You two still have a chance at escape, but we have to move quickly. With that, the man shot out from his car and started gathering a bunch of papers, filled to the brim with drawings and hardly intelligible text in a strange language. Take these, he said as he put the bag of papers in my hand. We left the house and carefully ventured into the dark streets, with a sky so riddled with thick clouds that even if a sun existed, it couldn't possibly brighten up the ruins of Gehenna. The street was mostly empty, just a few suffering, lost souls wandering, curious to our sudden presence. Though they started to follow us, they kept a safe distance. Don't pay them any attention. They won't bother us until we get closer to the light, the man said. He guided our way through the twisting and turning streets, eventually giving way to a vast, barren field riddled with the mutilated bodies of the lost souls. Without hesitating, the man started walking into the piles of dead, faster than the both of us despite his mangled leg. Ahead of us, miles and miles in the distance, lay massive cliffs stretching straight up into the sky, obscured at the top by the storm clouds. Then, as we touched the cold ground with our feet, a dim light appeared by the base of the cliffs, shooting through the air. What's that? I asked. Your way out. It's a cave that serves as a doorway between our worlds. I've tried to close it, but I am too weak. Now it will at least serve some purpose. As we passed the dead, some of them awoke, albeit too weak to rise. They stared us down, shrieking unintelligible words of agony. The guardian tapped the ground with his cane, the crystal facing down, and the dead fell silent once more. He fell to his knee as he lifted the cane, unable to support himself without its help. What happened to your leg? I finally worked up the courage to ask. It's a recent injury, caused by the sentinels, as you call them. They're usually confined to their void, kept at bay by my mere presence in this world. But recently they've been getting braver. I guess they know my time is up. What will happen without you? Mia asked. The sentinels will take over Gehenna, rule it as they used to millennia ago, and the gates will open, allowing any unfortunate soul to fall through the gaps of reality. Unless someone takes your place. I asked. He nodded. I looked over at Mia, who had finally realized the same as myself, that one of us had to stay behind and become the next guardian. Tom, Mia said as she looked at me with pleading eyes. I turned towards her, but before I could respond, the ground below us started moving. I looked down to see that the barren fields had given way to an infinite pile of corpses, all rapidly waking up by our presence, some just starting to scream, while others were aware enough to grab for us. The guardian pointed his cane at them again, and while some fell silent, he wasn't strong enough to keep them all at bay. Something's wrong, he said quietly. There was no way we could reach the cave with the lost souls awakening, and the guardian knew it. Without a word, he slammed the cane to the ground, falling down with it, and an impossibly strong light penetrated the air, instantly silencing the dead. As he saved our lives, his skin started to crack and burn, with the vast amounts of energy surging through him. Run for the cave, the man demanded as he collapsed to the ground, rapidly falling apart. We rushed to help him, but he was surrounded by an invisible barrier, making it impossible for us to reach him. No, leave me, he groaned. We looked at him in despair as the light started to fade, and the dead started to awaken once more. He'd bought us a few minutes, but time was quickly running out. Do as I say, and run. I grabbed Mia and pulled her with me, and we spurted for the cave only a few hundred feet away. The movement of thousands, if not millions of lost souls moved the ground enough to cause cracks that shot towards the cave, ripping rocks from the wall. The cave started collapsing, and we dove through just in time to avoid being smashed to pieces by the falling rocks, one hitting Mia on her shoulder, tearing through her flesh. Are you alright? I asked as I helped her to her feet. Yeah, the wound isn't too deep. I'll be fine. We turned towards the light that filled the cave. It was a frame of glowing fog surrounding a pitch-black portal, hanging a few feet above the ground. That's it? I asked. I guess so. It doesn't exactly look inviting, but there's nothing else around. Even the ground within the cave was riddled with the bodies of the dead. And with each second we spent there, they started to awaken. We have to hurry. Mia, you go first, I said as I walked closer to the portal. She didn't follow. She just stood back and stared at the swirling darkness hanging in front of us. I am not going with you, she said quietly. What? You heard him, Tom. This place needs a guardian. If we both leave, millions will suffer. I just can't do it. Mia was far too good of a person, unwilling to consider her own well-being over that of others. And I knew it in my heart that nothing I could say would change her mind. She walked up to hug me, a final goodbye before we parted ways for the rest of eternity. I held her tight as I whispered into her ear, I am sorry. Sorry about. Without letting her finish the sentence, I grabbed onto her, swung around, and shoved her into the portal. The second she realized what was happening, it was already too late, and her body washed away in the darkness, giving me a final look of sadness before she vanished. Gehenna needed a guardian, and Mia wouldn't have let me stay behind. So without any other choice, knowing that she had a much brighter future back on Earth than myself, I made the decision for her. One moment of betrayal, to give her a chance at a good life, even if it meant myself staying behind for the rest of time. It would be worth it. After Mia vanished, I felt at peace. Something within me knew she'd made it home. With that, I gained a whole new awareness of the place I would call home. The papers given to me by the old man, once filled with an incomprehensible language, suddenly turned into instructions for me to follow. And that's when I know the place had chosen me long before I even entered Gehenna. I was supposed to stay behind. My job now will be to close every gap between this world and Earth, meaning that after this message, no one will ever hear from me again. Tell my family I never suffered. And Mia, if you ever read this, I am sorry. I hope you live a great life.